Hey, morning, y'all. Today we're going to talk about Art Spiegelman's 1986 graphic novel Mouse, and also about how to find patterns and to do the kind of thinking you'll need to do to write your discussion forum posts and also your papers. So this particular video will talk about one way that you might understand Mouse, which is a kind of witnessing or bearing witness to a historical event and a historical trauma that Art is trying to communicate by telling his father's story. And that's why I picked this particular panel to go up front, is Vladik pointing to his own eyes saying, "It's my eyes." It's about sight, and that's the kind of case study that I'll use to walk you through one reading of Mouse. So how to read the literary text, and in particular, how to read a comic book. Vladimir Nabokov, who you may know as the author of Lolita, said that there is no reading literature, there's only rereading. And I think that's right, and I think it's important because there are various stages of reading. There is the physical process of reading, that is your eye scanning over a text that decodes visual data, and the brain kind of reconfigures that into something intelligible as a kind of narrative. This might happen in comics through closure, as Scott McCloud says, or the very kind of basic way that our eyes discern individual letters, groups of letters as phonemes, larger groups as words, and then words in relation to other words that form sentences, etc. The first time we read, our eyes and our brains are usually preoccupied with the very lowest level of quote-unquote reading, which is just literally understanding what's happening on the page. So part of Nabokov's argument is that to really read literature, you have to get past that level of just like what is going on here to get to the next level of why is this happening. And I think that's important because the job of a literary critic, particularly as you're getting up into 500 level classes, is to locate patterns within a text or patterns across texts if you're using multiple texts that make some aspect of it intelligible or understandable, particularly when that aspect that you're analyzing isn't obvious, right? So one of the things a literary critic does is to track images, repetitions, motifs, things that recur throughout text or text that when we look at it the right way, tell us something about what that author's trying to do, or what kind of influences are coming to bear on that author, what kind of social problems they're dealing with. And that all comes from the kind of careful and close reading and rereading through which we find these patterns. And if you're somebody who's read any of the books that we analyzed this semester before, one of the things you'll notice is that every time you read a text or reread a text, different patterns will emerge to you. Different things will become, will kind of pop up as what maybe seems like more important in one reading than it was the reading before that. The patterns can be textual, i.e. the language, the images. What I'm going to say is to focus on the eyes in Mouse. That might be a textual pattern, or thematic, right? You might see a certain kind of plot dynamic come up over and over again, the way a female character is treated, for example, or the way a particular group of people are depicted, something like that. So keep your eye out for those two different types of patterns, i.e. what's literally on the page might be a textual pattern, and then more thematic or plot-based patterns that you might see as kind of characteristic of a certain treatment of a certain aspect of the text, of a certain population, a certain type of interaction, anything that strikes you as similar over and over again. When you see that, that's your brain telling you, slow down, pay attention to this, right? So I always encourage students to read slowly, look for patterns. For me, I have to have a physical copy of the text to really do this. I have to take notes on it. That's kind of a problem with comics. They often have glossy pages, so make sure you've got a pen that's not going to smear and ruin your book and get all over your face and everything else. Underline things. If you don't want to write in your book, have a piece of paper there or a Google Doc open so you can take notes and come back to things. You'd be surprised how fast you forget where something was in the book if you don't take good notes. And start with a question. So when you are finished reading a book, or when you're finding these patterns, be what's called inductive. Don't be deductive. Don't look at a book and think, here's what I want to argue through this book. Instead, Read the book and let the argument come to you as the patterns reveal themselves and as you start to notice the patterns. Deductive reasoning is the most fallacious thing you could do. So avoid that at all costs. So here are some questions that I'm going to put up as discussion post questions next week. And I'm going to take up the first of those in the remainder of this video. Is why are there so many references to the eyes and to sight in mouse, right? So you can read the rest of these questions on your own, but notice the bottom. You can write about other topics than this. I have no problem with that. If something strikes you and you really want to run with it, let's talk it through, but you got to get approval first. Students have come up with some crazy stuff over the years, and I just want to make sure it's above board before we move forward. So I'm going to take up this question. Why are there so many references to sight, to the eyes, particularly Vladik, throughout the text? So once you've got a good question, my suggestion is that you reread the text and try to come up with a good answer to it. Try to take more notes. Try to notice if there are wrinkles to that question that you hadn't noticed before. Notice if there are different ways that pattern or theme manifests that you didn't notice the time before. Make sure you've got as much support and as much of a kind of comprehensive understanding of the text as possible before you move forward. So saying that the beginning of a good argument is a question, right? And once you've really thought through that question, it becomes a thesis once you make the move from here's something I noticed to here's something I noticed and here's why I think it's important. So as I say here, a thesis can be some form of your question plus some, in order to kind of connector, some logical extension or connection, and then the answer to that question. Now, the words "in order to" do not need to be in your blog post. They don't need to be in your papers. They don't need to be in your thinking at all. It's just, if you say, there's so many references to the eyes and mouse because, and then you answer it, now you're on the way to a thesis. A thesis is not, there are lots of references to the eyes in mouse. Yeah, I can see that. That's obvious. What I want to know is why it's there and why it's important to your particular analysis. And then as you are writing your discussion posts and your papers, it's going to be really important that you draw support from the text. If you write a discussion forum post and you don't have references to the text, you messed up, right? You have to use support from close reading, from looking at the language, from looking at the images, and incorporate that as the support, just like you would use data, just like you would use quotes in your writing for any other kind of class, right? So quote specific language and or panels and also analyze them. As you can see throughout this PowerPoint, I literally took my phone out when I thought I saw something important, took a photo of it, then went to Google Photos on my computer, just opened up Paint and copied and pasted just the individual panels I wanted to work with. That's how I do it, and I would encourage you to do whatever you need to do to make the images come as part of your discussion forum panels, posts, and also as part of your papers. The last thing I'll say about this is whenever you do incorporate language or images from a text, make sure you spend as much time analyzing them. Make sure you spell space correctly too. Analyzing the quotes as the quote or image takes. It won't be obvious to your reader what that quote or image means in the way that it's obvious to you. So make it obvious through your words and through your language. So Mouse is Survivor's Tale is one of the most important graphic novels ever published. It's published in 1986, although it was serialized from 80 to 91 in Raw magazine, which is one of Spiegelman's magazines. Won the Pulitzer in the special category in 1992. And it really works from important forms of Holocaust lit, such as the written memoir and photography. You probably read Elie Wiesel's Night. You probably read Primo Levi's The Drowned and the Saved, for example. Photography is a really important part following General Eisenhower, who made it a big part of his mission following the Holocaust to document what happened, to make sure that no one could ever deny what had happened, even though people do now. They're wrong, of course, but people do that. So this particular text takes up these two forms of Holocaust lit by creating a novelistic version of what happened and also wedding that to a depiction, a visual depiction that is kind of inescapable. If you read this, Mouse, you can't get away from the images. If you actually read it, you're forced to confront this version of what happened, right? So some kind of big terms that you might think through as you're working with Mouse is the idea of a frame tale. So it fictionalizes the storytelling. It is Art and Vladek talking to each other. That's the frame. And the tale itself is what happened to Vladek and Anya and Richiu and the other Jews throughout the text, right? You can think of the Princess Bride and the Canterbury Tales as other frame tales. It also draws attention through that frame tale to the layers of mediation. So what I mean by that is what happened in history, the reality, the objective kind of empirical reality of what happened to Vladek is at one level. Then we get Vladek's version that he tells to Art, and then we get Art's version that he communicates to us through Mouse. So there's two levels of mediation, at least, between reality and what happened. And I think Mouse is aware of that. It isn't to say that this isn't a historical piece, that this is fiction or something like that. But instead, I think Art Spiegelman and the text itself wants us to think about how far we can get away from the history as it happened, and how important, therefore, it is for us to stay in that history. And I think panels like this, when Vladek's saying such things, it's good to know exactly how it was, just in case. Right? Some other terms like allegory is a representation of a character or concept that explores a bigger issue. You probably read Animal Farm by George Orwell. That's often called an allegory. Most of the things written in the Middle Ages are allegories. But the allegory of this is partially that the different ethnic / national groups are depicted differently. So we have the Jews depicted as mice, Americans depicted as dogs, etc., and the various effects that has, right? This is a particularly haunting image as Vladek is thinking about the 4 hanged friends of his with whom he used to work, right? But we should think and be sensitive to the fact that these are depictions of people. But they're made mice by Spiegelman as a deliberate artistic choice, and that has come under some criticism. Some people think that is further dehumanizing and further inhabiting the kind of Nazi view of things. Other people think that this is a way that the graphic novel kind of opens up its subject matter. And rather than looking at hanged humans, when we see the hanged mice here, it is still evocative. It still provokes empathy. It still is very powerful, but perhaps less jarring than if these were depictions of human beings. So I'm not sure where I fall on that, but just know that that's a kind of debate out there about mass. As I said earlier, the idea of bearing witness to events that might have otherwise been forgotten was really important, and I was really struck by this. You know, when I was in high school in late 90s, because old, we were at a point in history where we were at, 55 years after the end of World War II. A lot of the survivors of the Holocaust were unfortunately passing away, and that was really poignant. But this panel, it was 1943. It wasn't left any other Jews that had 90 years. It really just brings home the scale and the magnitude of what the Nazis did in World War II. That in just an entire group of people, 30,000 people just in Sosnowiec, for example, gone. And the fact that there was an entire group of people of whom no one was above 90 years. And I think that that's something that Spiegelman's very careful about here. He wants us to kind of preserve and understand this history that otherwise might get overlooked or forgotten. So witnessing and trauma, this is from Schutz's essay. She says, but, move down here, all these authors, such as Spiegelman, refuse to show it through the lens of unspeakability or invisibility, it being trauma, instead registering its difficulty through inventive and various textual practice. So that's what I mean. Things like this is drawing attention to that historical trauma, that large-scale trauma, and rather than skirt away from it, faces it head on and forces us to kind of confront the uncomfortable realities of what happened before. And we can even see that play out in the Prisoner from Hell Planet, a kind of comic within a comic, in which Art talks about his mental kind of breakdown and his mother's suicide and its effect on his family. We can also see here the tension between realism and impressionism. There is a kind of realism to Mouse insofar it is about real events, but also it's impressionistic in that it's not rendered super realistic, right? The allegory, the shaggy lines, as they're called, those sorts of things really create that kind of tension between what's real and what we see on the page. And we have to kind of think through, why did Spiegelman make those choices intentionally. All right, thanks for listening. I'll see you next week.